Massachusetts is one of the main destinations in the US for immigrants from Haiti. That's one of the reasons for the level of anxiety and fear triggered by the recent assassination of Haiti's President Jovenel Moïse. But the assassination follows mounting concerns about the country's political direction and the escalation of gang violence, on top of a long history of internal power struggles and external interference. To help us put the recent events into context is our guest, the Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives, along with being the Faculty Coordinator for Global Learning and a Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. We'd like to welcome Dr. Regine Jackson. Thank you very much for being with us, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
Doctor, one more piece of introduction. You also spent some time here in Boston, right?
Yes, I grew up in Boston. I very much consider Boston home. I've lived in Atlanta for almost 20 years, but Boston is very much my home. My parents migrated to the US in the 60s, but we've lived in Boston since 1976.
Doctor, I want to ask you about the reaction to the assassination. I imagine you've been following this closely, certainly at the time when you were trying to process that act of violence. You were well aware that the President Jovenel Moïse was somebody that a lot of people in Haiti were very worried about. They were protesting against him. They thought he was becoming more authoritarian in Haiti. So how did you process that mixture of impressions?
I have to say, it's been a long, almost 2 weeks now, and it's just a lot of mixed reactions, a lot of mixed emotions. Of course, the initial shock at hearing the news, the anxiety and worry about family members and colleagues in Haiti. And like anything else, I think there were so many reactions to this, in part because he was such a polarizing figure, but also because of the historical significance. We haven't had an assassination of a sitting president in Haiti since 1915. And this is very different from a coup or even an assassination attempt. This was a successful assassination and, almost fatally wounding the First Lady. So this was very difficult to process because there's so much mystery still and so many questions that arise in the wake of this.
It also looks as if there's a lack of recovery from some of the recent catastrophes. You have the earthquake, you have the hurricane, there was an epidemic of cholera that was involved with the recovery from the earthquake. Then you have COVID. I mean, is it possible to sort of sort things out and hold an election to make everything work normally within a matter of months, given that?
Right. And those are some of the big headline events, right? There have also been more recently these assassinations, the murdering of the journalists in the Delmar 32 neighborhood, just a few weeks before Moïse's assassination, was a really startling event in and of itself, because these were two of the 15 people killed were activists, journalists, and when you see those kinds of attacks on the press and on people who are trying to provide information, that's something that's startling. The food riots, the riots and demonstrations against the extension of Moïse's political term have also been very worrying. This has been a mounting, the situation has been mounting over quite some time, and it's layered on top of everything, right? On top of COVID, on top of cholera, on top of food insecurity and a lack of sort of a public health infrastructure. It gets very messy and tangled very quickly. And this, I think the thing that worries me the most is that this is just one more thing on top of everything else. Still haven't fully recovered from the earthquake.
I want to ask you about the long narrative here, because Haiti was this exemplary chapter in anti-colonial independence, and at the same time, it's also the opposite. It's this warning about colonial interference or post-colonial interference, as the case may be. How much of that is really the issue here?
It's always an issue. I'm a sociologist, not a historian, but I do favor these longer term analyses, right? These sort of structural, historical analyses of Haiti, trying to understand what's going on there. And, one scholar refers to Haiti as the longest neo-colonial experiment, right, in the West. And this is something that is significant, given the long history of intervention. And yet, when something goes wrong in Haiti, it's always perceived as an internal problem without that kind of perspective that looks at looks at the Caribbean context or the Western context, where Haiti has always been sort of disadvantaged by, in some ways, being in the Western Hemisphere with such different powers, and the US among them, right? Sort of intervening in its affairs.
I want to ask you about the capacity within Haiti to take things into a better direction, because I've seen some of the people reacting to the crisis and they're saying, well, there is this sort of civil society sector that if you just avoid too much interference and you give them a little support, they can take the ball and run with it. I know that sounds very optimistic, but I mean, is there at least some possibility of that in Haiti?
I think there is. I think, I think there's a real challenge for the way that we think about Haiti in terms of its governance structures outside the box of the nation state, right? And with a kind of approach to governance that, at the one hand, is more global in focus, but on the other hand is also more local, right? In terms of thinking about Haiti beyond just Port-au-Prince, right? Beyond just the metropolitan areas, but also including and thinking about these non-urban areas, thinking about Haiti and what it might need and ways it might develop and flourish in a Caribbean context, and not just locked in this relationship with the United States. And I think that's something that's really important in terms of moving out of this current crisis. Short term, I think the main thing is meaningful security, right? Really prioritizing the health and safety of Haitian citizens, people in Haiti, and thinking about not just military security and not just this kind of police state, but food security, access to healthcare, safety of journalists, right? All of these things, I think, are the directions, the things that need to happen before we can, in addition to thinking about preparing for a viable election.
What about a viable election? With COVID going on right now, people worried about gang violence. We had enough trouble doing an election last November. What can you do in Haiti?
Right. I think it's very possible to have legitimate elections in Haiti if the resources are devoted to that. Right. If, like you mentioned, the support came from the external sources, the international community, to work with civil society and agents in Haiti who are interested in fair and legitimate elections. I think the will of people in Haiti is there to make that happen.
Finally, the usual formula as a way out of crisis is you have external support with external agendas. You have the formality of democracy and free market. It's maybe a tired formula. Shouldn't it be changed perhaps in some way?
I think so. I think it has to change. It has to recognize that you know, there's not one Haitian narrative or perspective or interest, that there are multiple, right? That's what democracy means, that there are multiple perspectives, and it doesn't require full sort of consensus, but it does require cooperation. And it does require, prioritizing safety and security of the people.